The ancient Egyptians have deliberately left us with a cool image of themselves. Ancient Egypt in its Sunday best. It's very difficult to see these people as living flesh and blood. Well, every now and again you get just a little chink in the curtain. There's certainly one here. I'll read you a bit of a story. It says, one day the king was sad, so he assembled the officers of his palace in order to seek for him a diversion, but he found none. And then he said, go bring me the scribe of the book. Jar Jar Emank is a wise man, you see. And he was brought straight away. And his majesty said unto him, I have assembled the officers of the palace together in order to seek a diversion, but I could find none. It's the biggest man in Egypt, but he's still sad.
And Jar Jar Emank said unto him, if thy majesty would but partake thee to the lake of the great house, man thee a boat with all fair damsels, then will the heart of thy majesty be diverted, when thou shouldst see how they row to and fro, and thou viewest their pleasant nesting places on thy lake, and viewest their fields and pleasant banks. His majesty said, I will go boating. Have brought to me 20 paddles of ebony enwrought with gold. Have brought to me 20 women, of those with the fairest limbs and with beauteous breasts and braided tresses, such as have not yet given birth. And moreover have brought to me 20 nets, and give these nets to the women instead of their clothes. And it was done, according to all that his majesty commanded. And they rowed to and fro, and the heart of his majesty was glad when he beheld how they rowed.
Most of ancient Egypt is public ruins, not private memoirs. That public image is concerned with perfection, control of an eternal state where all have their place. But the dictates of these controlling powers can show us a very human face.
If you take as a concubine one who is happy, known in the town, if she is fickle and lives for the moment, then don't send her away, but make her fat with eating. Joyful ones bring happiness. A man whose belly is empty is an accuser. Follow your heart as long as you live, and do no more than is asked for. A wise man rises early to establish himself, but a foolish man does not do so. How good it is when a son listens to his father. A son who listens to his father is valued by his superiors. If you are prosperous and have founded a family, love your wife as is proper. Fill her belly, clothe her back, anoint her limbs with oil. Gladden her heart as long as she may live, for she is a fertile field for her Lord.
That's the sort of thing Meruka and his age believed in. They're the wisdom texts of the day. We are in the great chapel in the tomb of this man, Meruka, who around 2400 BC was Prime Minister of Egypt and brother-in-law of the king. The tomb is built in the shadow of his king's pyramid. Even a man of Meruka's position depended upon the king for his continuing power in the next world. The tomb's filled with pictures of Meruka and his family, hunting, shooting, fishing, administering his estate, just like they did in life. These aren't just pictures of Meruka's daily life, old newsreels, or records of jolly hunting japes that Meruka wanted to take with him to the next world. These scenes are very carefully organised, the standard language of every tomb. When the sculptors kept their eyes fresh and their delight in the world, they were the best animal artists of all time. The framework of these lively pictures is as formal as high tea, as ritualised as a church service, but the scenes still manage to show something of everyday life. Meruka's labourers would bring food from his estates to the spirit of their lord. In his lifetime, Meruka would have established a foundation of priests to care for his spirit after death. So what happens today now that the priests are gone? Well, Meruka even has an answer to that. This is your absolutely standard Mark I ancient Egyptian survival kit. If the priests who were delivering the offerings to the tomb stopped, at least this carved on the wall will give you a decent meal to eat and something to wear. Begins from the top. 1,000 bread, 1,000 beer, 1,000 oxen, 1,000 geese, and these signs at the bottom are thousands of special sorts of clothes that you would wear. Here, the priest would come up and leave the offerings of food and drink for Meruka's spirit to come out from his burial chamber to partake of the offerings they left. And it's still going on because all around in the tomb there are scenes of offerers bringing. So even today, when we've stopped putting the offerings here, still the spirit of Meruka is receiving nourishment from the life of his tomb. The extraordinary interdependence at all levels of ancient Egyptian society mirrored the climate and landscape of their country. The environment, human society and the gods were all part of a perfectly tuned machine that endlessly revolved around the agricultural year in perfect harmony. From Old Kingdom times, the whole country was organised into a series of units which were run and controlled by the kings, the nobles, and the big temples. Poor old peasants who worked the land had a lot of their taxes taken from them in the form of food. It's a very strange system, really, when you think about it. It means that the offerings that were sent to the temple became a contract between man and the gods, and that contract was in food. It really is one of the few systems in the world that's ever used God to gather the taxes, which of course in Egypt, where the gods controlled the flow of the river and all the elements, is very appropriate. These days, the Nile is completely controlled by the engineers of the High Dam. It doesn't go up and down more than a foot or two. But in ancient times it was very different. The river was very much higher, typically level about here somewhere. But on July the 15th, which was the ancient New Year's Day, the Nile really started to rise, up and up the steps. And as it came up through the Nilometers, metre by metre, it was watched very anxiously by the priests. It was critical. We'd usually end up about 10 metres above its normal level. 1 or 2 metres too low, and there was a 75% crop failure. Not only meant starvation that year, but no seed for the following seasons. A couple of yards up this way, the dikes around the towns would burst. There'd be great destruction. The crops would come in late. It was almost an equal disaster. And so, you can see that order and regularity, which is so typical of so many things from the Egyptian civilization, isn't really a result of some boring old conservatism, but is really the knowledge that the odd is a disaster, and that the typical, the normal, the average flood is what keeps Egypt prosperous and healthy. But there are times, of course, when even the nobles and the kings couldn't control what was happening to the country, when the Nile was too low or too high. And when the gods deserted them, there was real trouble.
Nay, but corn hath perished everywhere. People are stripped of clothing, perfume, and oil. Everyone saith there is no more, the storehouse is bare. Nay, but the face is pale, the bowman is ready. Nay, the plunderers are everywhere. Nay, but the children of princes, men dash them against walls. Nay, but the Nile is in flood, yet none plougheth for him. Every man saith, we know not what hath happened throughout the land.
It's in places like this that you can really see the difference between the desert and the cultivation. It's really the knife edge between life and death here in Egypt. And it's that knife edge which was affected in the course of the Old Kingdom. The annual flooding of the Nile got lower and lower and lower. And the king's power was affected because he was the guy between the people and the gods. And the people obviously couldn't trust him so much if he wasn't able to give them the goods, produce them the annual inundation and wealth which they wanted. So the country slowly started to sink, and the great ages of the pyramids, the early pyramids, are gone. You can see, if you look at these ones here in Abu Sir, that they're very much smaller and less precisely made. Perhaps it was because of the gradually reducing power of the king and a failing economy that the later kings of the Old Kingdom were no longer able to mobilise the entire nation to build their pyramids for them. But they did have very specialised gangs of masons, and these guys went all over Egypt seeking out the wonderful hard stones that are all over the country. This stone is a beautiful black granite, variegated granite, comes from Aswan, about 600 miles to the south. This here is a basalt, very, very hard stone, brought from the Western Desert, about 600 miles as well. And this is a soft Tura limestone, just from the other side of the river. These columns here, lovely rose granite, also come from Aswan. And this is the name of the king, Sahura, was the second king of the 5th dynasty. Royal names put in cartouches. It's these ovals of rope that go around the hieroglyphs. And all the inscription is cut. The man who holds a small piece of flint and he's going peck, 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 bang, bang like that down the side of the stone. And the finer points are all finished off with soft copper chisels.
Nay, but the highborn are full of lamentations, and the poor are full of joy. Every tongue saith, let us drive out the powerful from our midst.
Well, this inscription says that the kingdom of Egypt will last for all eternity. But in actual fact, the age of the pyramid builders collapsed about 2100 BC in complete chaos. It was probably a mixture of the bad Niles and the barons, who got so powerful they started to take over the kingship itself. It was an age of terrible chaos. And there are some texts, some very moving texts, that were written at a later period, but they reflect this age very well.
Nay, but laughter hath perished and is no longer made. It is grief that walketh through the land, mingled with lamentations. Nay, a man goeth to plough with the shield, for the plunderers are everywhere. Nay, but the heart is violent, plague stalketh through the land, and blood is everywhere.
And that, of course, was completely true. The hinge had busted, Egypt was flapping around. There was no central authority, no government, no large monuments being made, no law and order nationwide. There was a few pockets that were more or less well governed by local baronies. The Great Age, the Pyramid Age, the age of the great monuments, that had really come to an end. I suppose the civil wars and the so-called times of troubles were much like this, but less elegant. You can just see all the lads piling into their boats and going down the next village to beat the living daylights out of them. And of course, at times like that, people do get killed. In fact, my driver told me a story the other day. He can't go to the next village near him because the score is 3-2 in their favour. During these times of troubles, a man called Antifi organised the villages in this area, and together they conquered the Nile Valley. Antifi and his valiant band, as he called them, brought some security to the area. He even claims to have distributed wheat to the starving from his granaries. He was probably knocked off by the guy who eventually conquered Egypt from Thebes, about 50 miles downstream. But before he died, he'd already made his tomb. He made it in this pyramid-shaped hill. The hill was a natural one. It looked like a pyramid, but it wasn't really a pyramid. Antifi could have never have afforded one. Well, this is Mr. Antifi's tomb chapel. There isn't a straight line in the place. I think it's decorated with more energy and enthusiasm than skill. But that's what the times were like, really. And it's a bit amazing that Antifi was even able to get something this big and important. Looks like Mr. Antifi is off to a celestial stick fight. Seder.
Ja,
Seder. Feestamper? Is it a feestamper for Inglaterra?
Ja.
Christ. That's what his stamper for England. Christmas card.
Christmas. Ja, for Christmas card.
Yep. Funny old world. Just sending a card for Christmas to my mother. It's about 85 outside, and it's in the middle of an ancient cemetery. But here the West has invaded the place, so we're sending Christmas. Peace, Stamper. Shukran. Shukran. Time of Christmas, Henna?
Ja, die Christmas.
Into Christiani, well?
Muslim.
Into Muslimani,
Ja, Christian.
Well, die Christiani.
Yes. Orthodox.
Yes, salam. Orthodox cult. One Christian and one Muslimani, huh?
Ja, Muslimani, Muslim album.
See, we have the two religions. One Clark is a Muslim, the other's a Christian. Egypt's been invaded so many times by so many different religions and ideas. I mean, the idea of a post office in the middle of a cemetery is crazy enough. You've got these dear little Clarks struggling with this system to maintain, which after all is a relic from colonial times. It's a strange thing. The invaders often, and especially in the last century after all, came with real terror and produced a lot of misery. They often left things behind. And it's true of the invasion that happened 1700 BC with the Hyksos. They came to the country, they were ill-educated, Asiatic sheep farmers as much as one can know about them. They took the country over and they ran it for 200 years. And then the ancient Egyptians took the very devices which they'd been conquered with, new chariots, new swords, different type of shield, and a wonderful new water irrigation system, which is really exactly what Egypt needed. They took all these devices and they used them to make an empire. But it did produce one feeling of tremendous insecurity in the ancient Egyptians. They'd never really been invaded before. Nile Valley was shut off and quiet. And the fact that any old sheep farm could come in and take the country over really upset them. And so they started a conquest of empire. Perhaps that's how all empires start, from insecurity. Certainly how the Egyptian one started. It was the greatest empire the world had ever seen up until that point. Now I've got to post this to a faded outpost of empire. Shukran. Wassalama. You must wonder what this great empire meant to the ordinary people of Egypt. One thing seems sure. The country prospered, the court grew in size and magnificence, and was filled with politics, personalities, and therefore intrigue. A whole new world opens up, allowing us another rare glimpse behind the mask of state. And some of these new kingdom epics have got more sexy high life in them than a good cabinet scandal. This temple, for instance, was squabbled over by a woman who claimed to be a king, a young warrior claiming his rights, and the abused spirit of a dead father. The Egyptologists have really made a ball out of a very complicated story. Even her name has changed over the last 100 years. She started off as Amenitguri. She went to Hatshepsut. Then she went to Hatshepsut. Then she went to Hatshepsut. Then she went to Hatshepsut. Now it's back at Hatshepsut. Story changed a lot too. That started off as one story, then a German guy came along and said it wasn't like that, it was like something else really. And then a Swiss guy came along and changed the story, and then an American came along and put us all right at the end. So now we've got one good story of revenge and a queen called Hatshepsut. All these old scholarly arguments about who was who in ancient Egypt will be only of academic interest were it not for the fact that the Queen Hatshepsut has become quite a cult figure today. And Thutmose III, well, he's become the Napoleon of ancient Egypt, founder of mighty empires, the man who really made Thebes rich. How do we know about their history, though? How, in the end, did they really work it out? Well, it was really on walls like this. Thutmose III's name's up there. But Hatshepsut's, well, that's smashed and broken. He's taken it out, cut it out. And people have worked out that it was Thutmose III's men who did it. There's a lot of little things like this. Who bashed whose name off, who came along and put it on again afterwards. They're the things that you sort of fit history together with. Now, they tell you who was wielding the chisel, but what they don't tell you is what the people thought who were doing it, what their emotions were. There's one little monument here in Deir el-Bakri, up in the cliffs, just up there, that does. Thutmose III waited more than 20 years for Auntie Hatshepsut to get off the throne and leave him in sole charge of Egypt. It was while he waited she built her beautiful temple. While she was building her beautiful temple, some of Thutmose's cronies used to come and sit up here in this cave just above it and think about things. They also brought their beer with them. Now this, it's a 3,500-year-old empty. Egyptians made their beer in a strange way. They fill pots like this up with water and then dump sort of half-baked bread with lots of yeast in it. Made a horrible sticky mess, which fermented rather well. Sometimes they'd strain it and drink it, sometimes they just drank it, but either way I think it made them pretty plastered. Actually, this half-finished tomb, which was already 500 years old when they found it, was used by the lads as a sort of a drinking club. They come in here and sit and drink and think and talk and chatter and paint on the walls and scribble their names about the place. One of the guys was a bit better draftsman than the rest too. And he got to thinking how weird it was that a woman should call herself a king. He made a rather pointed comment about it. The front figure, bending over, is wearing a king's wig, yet is, apparently, a woman. This isn't lavatory humour. It's the ambivalent posture of a woman who would be king. It's a political cartoon. Those drawings aren't the gentlest comments on human behaviour, though when they wanted to, the ancients could describe their sexual feelings in a beautiful manner. It's such a shame that prudish scholars have buried most of the evidence in museum storerooms.
It is pleasant to go to the water in order to bathe in your presence, that I might let you see my beauty and my tunic of fine linen when it is wet. I go with you into the water, and come to you with a red fish that lies beautifully on my fingers. Come and look at me. The sycamore slipped a letter into the hand of the maiden, the daughter of the chief gardener, and made her run to her lover. Come and pass the time with your maiden, for the garden is in full bloom. There are bars and shelters for you. The gardeners are glad when they see you. The servants bring beer, all manner of bread and many flowers, and all manner of refreshing fruit. Come and spend the day in merriment and sit in my shadow. And her love sits on her right hand. She makes him drink and listens to all that he says.
But the sycamore is discreet. It speaks not of what it has seen. It says not a word. But trees weren't meant just for lovers to sit under. In the Valley of the Kings, sexuality, maternity, and death intertwine around images of resurrection. And even in this bone-dry place, the tree plays an important part. In its identity as the mother of the king, the tree goddess suckles the monarch with her celestial milk. When the king dies, a coffin, made of her wood, shelters the king in a womb-like tomb, where for all eternity he lies in union with his own mother to generate the royal resurrection. And this is the tomb of Thutmose III, cut deep into the Valley of the Kings, shortly after he managed to kick his auntie Hatshepsut off of the throne. He was buried in his sarcophagus, the wooden coffins protecting his body nestling inside. I spent a couple of years in this tomb, measuring all the parts and drawing all the details. And the thing that struck me about it is its extraordinary accuracy. The geometry here is perfect. It's quite amazing. Look at this great swinging shape of the burial chamber. It's made like a roll of papyrus. In a sense, that's what it is, because the scenes on all the walls are like a guidebook to the underworld. But you really can't say guidebook, because it's more than that. Because when the artists made this tomb, they actually made the underworld itself. The text that the royal scribe drew for the dead king on the walls of his burial chamber was a text called Umduat, that which is in the other world. And that was their way of bringing the other world into his chamber. Well, it describes the journey of the dead king through 12 hours of the night. So the book is in 12 divisions round the walls. And the journey goes underground. The king goes down with the setting sun, travels along in the underworld, and then goes up again to be born again. And so instead of the sky at the top of the scene, you see sand running above the registers. And the king, because he's on a journey, well, he's normally in a boat, usually at any rate, which means he's got to have water as well, like that. The book begins over here. The writings of the hidden chamber, the place where the gods and the spirits stand. Knowledge of the power of what is in the other world. And that's a pretty big deal, isn't it? That's how the Umduat begins, with this register here telling you what's going on. Here's the king on his boat, already come down from the horizon, accompanied by his mother and a few other gods for company. And here, as he enters the underworld, he's been drawn as a scarab beetle, a typical Egyptian dung beetle that you see around all over the place. It was a sacred symbol for the Egyptians. It meant transformation, becoming. And that's what was happening to the underworld and the king here. The king was being reborn, and as the text said, the darkness is lit because the king had come. This is the 4th hour of the night. The doors of the deepest part of the underworld have been opened, so the king in his boat can slip down into the mysterious, utter darkness at the bottom. And there, the boat is only lit by the serpents in the prow of the boat, who breathe fire to light the darkness. It's an extraordinary image. It's the point at which the king's resurrection really begins. Actually, in the 2nd and 3rd hours, he's been given different bits of him back from earth, such as his mind and his will, and other attributes of his soul. And that's what this text is really about. It's not just a collection of fairy stories with snakes and serpents and all that sort of thing. It's really about splitting up the personality of somebody and then describing how these different aspects would be between death and rebirth. It's a very, very complicated idea, a very subtle one that the Egyptians tried to get across. It's in the 5th hour that things really start to go off pop. You can see the gods and goddesses are still pulling the boat along. What's really going in the depths of the underworld is this amazing image here. This is in utter darkness. You see the sand is going right round the edge of it. It's as if the chrysalis of the king is just beginning to move a little. There's a roaring, like the roaring of a sky during a storm, it says. And inside this amazing egg, the 3-headed snake which swallowed the king earlier on is having to disgorge him and is coming up like Horus, the son of the sun god, whose flesh shines like the sun. And he's moving and giving so much energy that he's pushing up these registers. Very unusual in Egyptian art. You don't often see that. And even old Kepa beetle up here has grabbed hold of the tow rope in an effort to drag the king out of the eastern horizon. After that marvellous rebirth in the 5th hour, well, it's all just straight uphill for the king. He fights through 6 hours of incredible battles. Some things are so weird and old that nobody understands them, not even the people who wrote them. But they're things that went on for thousands of years in Egyptian history and was all kept right there for the record. So by the time the 12th hour came along, well, it's just like the Hallelujah chorus, Egyptian style. Everything's going for the gods. Here's the king, every bit of him restored to his former self, like he was when he was alive. There's his flesh and his mind and his spirit and all the other bits of his personality. Even the old Beatles hitched a ride. The gods who are pulling him, well, they're all looking along. And the great old snake, the old snake who'd fought so many battles with him, he's helping pull as well. And they're pulling him along, and the horizon is curving right down through the picture. And they're pulling him along through the eastern horizon, and there is the beetle pushing the actual disk of the sun through the sky. And whilst this magic event is taking place, down in the underworld, the mummy of the king is left. All the gods of the underworld, well, they're behind him, worshipping him. Now, you know, the Egyptians weren't as daft as to think that if they didn't go through all these rituals and make magic books, the sun wouldn't come up in the morning. They were very intelligent people. But they did think that if it happened outside of the scheme which they put on it, that really it was absolutely meaningless, that life had no point. And if you ask any religious person what their life would be without religion, they would say just that, it would have no point. So that's what the Egyptians were doing, was ordering their understanding of things and making a point. And for Tutmosis III, the way they actually focused his part of the power in the great daily resurrection of the sun, well, that was done here partly, and the power was fused out, focused into his temple. And for that, there was a very special element in the back of his temple, and it was the oldest element in Egyptian religion. It was called the false door. Well, Tutmosis III's great mortuary temple is long gone, pulled down, smashed to bits. But archaeologists found the great false door from the back and set it up here. It's quite as beautiful as his tomb. And to achieve this sort of elegance, you can leave nothing to chance. Look at this. Everything carefully measured. Every line, every dot, every piece of this design has been thought about, considered, weighed, measured out. It's actually one of my favourite bits of Egyptian art. It's nothing much really, it's just the name of the king. But just look at the way it's done, it's extraordinary. It has all that integrity of workmanship. It's sort of like the Concorde. You design something for a purpose and you make it well and it ends up being beautiful.